The silver snap of Martin Hale's pen cut through the conference room. He leaned back, smirking, while Evan strutted in like he already owned the floor. Laughter rippled, and Beverly's color-coded audit binder sat untouched, dismissed as a relic. Anger burned, but she stayed silent, her calm sharper than their mockery. Because buried inside one overlooked contract clause was a trigger they hadn't seen, a line of fine print that could shift everything with the weight of law. One detail, one transfer, one collapse. Before I continue, where are you watching from? Smash that like button and subscribe. This collapse is just getting started. The meeting was supposed to be routine, a quarterly alignment where compliance updates were shared and filed away. Instead, Martin Hale turned it into theater. He leaned back in his chair, twirling his pen with the satisfaction of a man who knew no one would challenge him. "We can't keep drowning in paperwork," he announced, gesturing toward Beverly's binder stacked neatly at her side. "This company needs agility, not another encyclopedia of rules." A few executives chuckled, though their eyes stayed on the table. Beverly kept her posture steady, her hands folded, expression unreadable. Martin wasn't finished. With a wave toward the door, he summoned Evan, his son, who walked in wearing a blazer too sharp for his experience. "Here's the future," Martin declared, "someone who understands disruption, not bureaucracy." Evan smirked as though the room already belonged to him. The silence that followed stung more than the words. No one spoke in Beverly's defense. No one reminded Martin that her binders had shielded Summit Point through 3 separate regulatory reviews. She simply clicked her pen once, drew a small line in the margin of her notes, and let the performance play out. Martin believed he had put her in her place. Evan believed he had inherited her authority. Beverly understood something neither of them did. Humiliation fades, but records remain. And the binder Martin mocked still held every clause, every safeguard, and every mechanism that could outlast the applause of that hollow room. The retaliation didn't arrive as a single blow, but as a series of quiet cuts, each one small enough to dismiss, together sharp enough to bleed her authority dry. The first came in the form of a budget freeze. Beverly opened her dashboard one morning to find her compliance funds reallocated under Evan's Innovation Center, leaving her with nothing to run the audits she had scheduled. Then her access began to shrink. Calendar invites that once carried her name no longer appeared. Governance calls with high-value clients proceeded without her. And when she asked about the oversight, HR blamed a scheduling glitch. The glitches always excluded her. Reports she submitted were rerouted for executive review and never returned. A procurement contract she flagged for conflicts disappeared into Martin's office, later re-emerging with Evan's initials scribbled across it. Even the shared drive she had built over a decade shifted under her feet. Permissions were revoked, folders marked obsolete, files she maintained suddenly deleted without explanation. When she raised the issue, Martin brushed her off, saying, "We don't need so much noise in the system." The message was clear. Erase her presence, weaken her influence, and prepare the ground for her removal. Beverly didn't fight back with protests or pleas. Instead, she cataloged each change with precision. Every missing file, every blocked calendar, every buried report was noted and time-stamped. They thought they were cutting her out of relevance. What they didn't realize was that every cut left a trace, and Beverly was already assembling those traces into something stronger than a title: evidence. The official demotion landed in Beverly's inbox at 8:07 a.m. on a Tuesday. The subject line so sterile it almost looked like spam. Role realignment notification. She clicked it once, skimmed the phrases: efficiency restructuring, better alignment with strategic priorities, new responsibilities reflecting organizational needs, and saw her new title in bold: Documentation Coordinator, Policy Archives. From senior compliance manager to glorified file clerk in a single sentence. No one said it out loud, but the message was clear. She was being boxed up, shelved like the very binders Martin loved to ridicule. The irony wasn't lost on her. They thought by reducing her role to archives, they had taken her power. But Beverly understood the archives better than anyone. She knew the language of policies, the fine print of client contracts, the weight of clauses buried in pages executives never read. Where Martin and Evan saw dust, she saw triggers. That morning, she pulled a thin folder from the stack she was reassigned to manage. Summit Point's master client agreements. Every contract had addenda, updates, compliance riders. She knew them by memory, but this time she reviewed with sharper eyes. On page 19 of one agreement, she drafted a subtle but binding clause, logged through official channels, co-signed by a mid-level counsel who didn't ask questions because Beverly's reputation for accuracy made review feel unnecessary. The clause was precise. If the designated project lead were reassigned within an active reporting cycle, fiduciary liability would transfer directly to the initiating executive. It was governance, not sabotage. Protection for clients, guardrails against recklessness. Yet she positioned it so neatly that Martin, in his arrogance, would never see it. He had dismissed her as irrelevant. Evan had mocked her obsession with red tape. Neither would realize that the tape was now wrapped around them. Over the next 2 weeks, Beverly layered her preparations. She compiled audit log discrepancies, noting where Evan had signed approvals without certifications. She archived HR's non-response to her complaints, time-stamped every deflection. She filed unreported conflict of interest declarations linked to Evan's personal contracts. All of it went into a disclosure packet scheduled through Summit Point's secure system. If triggered, it would automatically deliver itself to Patricia Gomez, the audit committee chair, with attachments so complete they could not be ignored. It wasn't vengeance. It was discipline. Beverly didn't drink from the well of revenge. She drank from the fountain of records. Quietly, she set the system clock. If her role was reassigned, the packet would awaken, silent but absolute. No alarms, no flashing lights, just a message that said, "This transfer has consequences." They thought demoting her stripped her power. In reality, it gave her cover. While Martin strutted through meetings and Evan pitched slogans about disruption, Beverly sat at her desk in the policy archives, typing lines of text that looked harmless, even mundane. But each keystroke tightened the knot. They had written her off as a relic. She was writing the ledger that would decide who survived the audit. It happened on a Thursday morning, the kind of gray, half-lit day that made the office feel more like a waiting room than a headquarters. Beverly was called into conference room B, where Martin Hale sat flanked by an HR partner clutching a clipboard. He didn't bother with preamble. "We're going in a different direction," he said, his tone rehearsed, almost casual, as if he were announcing a new lunch vendor. Beverly's nameplate on the agenda was already crossed out in red ink. Evan stood by the window, arms folded, wearing a grin too wide for the gravity of the moment. "Effective immediately," Martin continued. "Evan will take over your responsibilities." Fresh perspective, adaptive leadership. The HR partner slid a stapled packet across the table, the cover sheet already bearing Beverly's name in block letters. She didn't touch it. She didn't argue. She asked only one question, her voice steady as glass. "Is this final?" Martin smirked. "Yes, and we'll give you the rest of the day to collect your things." Evan chuckled softly, as though victory had a soundtrack. Beverly nodded once, rose without haste, and placed her badge not in Martin's hand, but on the clipboard, making the HR partner shuffle uncomfortably. Then she picked up her bag, already packed with her laptop, notebooks, and a single envelope labeled Q2 Governance Addendum. Martin's final flourish came as she walked toward the door. "No hard feelings, Beverly. Maybe someday you can consult. Help Evan get up to speed. She didn't turn back. Outside the glass wall, staff paused mid-keystroke to watch her leave, but she gave them nothing. No tears, no outburst, only silence. At precisely 9:14 a.m., Summit Point's system logged her reassignment. In that moment, the clause she had embedded weeks earlier began its countdown. Not loud, not visible, just a silent recalibration deep inside the compliance framework. The trap wasn't sprung with noise. It ticked quietly, waiting for the day the system itself would demand an answer. Martin thought he had closed a chapter. What he had done was start a timer. The first cracks appeared before the week was out. Evan's debut as Summit Point's Strategic Innovation Manager came in the form of canceling the quarterly client audit prep call. He waved it off as a waste of bandwidth, assuring finance that regulators didn't want endless paperwork, they wanted outcomes. A senior analyst opened her mouth to correct him, but stopped when Martin cut her off with a look that said dissent was unwelcome. By Monday, Beverly's inbox was still forwarding pings she no longer answered, her automated systems quietly logging every new inconsistency. Evan ignored the first set of SEC disclosure reminders. They sat unread in the compliance queue, flagged yellow, then red. He deleted them as spam, claiming Summit Point would modernize reporting next quarter. The deletion itself was logged automatically, but Evan never knew the system kept a shadow copy. He was too busy renaming folders with slogans like future-proof docs and lean ops drafts. Within days, client deliverables began slipping. A credit union flagged missing reconciliation documents that Beverly's team used to file monthly without fail. Evan told them it was an IT hiccup and promised a sleek dashboard update. Instead, he stripped out the reconciliation protocols entirely, leaving finance unable to match invoices to accounts. 2 regulators sent inquiry emails. Martin intercepted them and replied with vague assurances, attaching a slide deck Evan had made with stock photos of handshakes and the words, "Transparency in action," splashed across a blurry gradient. Internally, HR began to notice something stranger. Staff certifications, which Beverly had overseen with meticulous tracking, showed sudden gaps. Evan had overridden the certification module to streamline approvals. One compliance officer found her name listed as recertified, even though she hadn't logged in for 3 months. When she raised it to Martin, he told her to stop nitpicking and trust the system. But the system was no longer trustworthy. It was being gutted in real time. Then came the whistleblower hotline. An anonymous report detailed Evan's interference in ethics declarations, noting that he had deleted 3 conflict of interest forms linked to a vendor contract his college friend had pushed through procurement. The call transcript was filed, time-stamped, and, like all hotline reports, copied to Beverly's dormant oversight account. She read it on her back porch days later, glass of wine in hand, while Evan still strutted through the office convinced no one was watching. Contractors began to grumble. Payments were late because Evan had simplified the accounts payable system by removing escalation tags he didn't understand. 2 consultants walked off after 30 days without pay. Their exit memo, circulated quietly among mid-level staff, ended with a line that stuck like a nail in the wall. "This is not a Beverly problem. This is leadership malpractice." The phrase spread through side channels like wildfire, whispered in kitchen corners and Slack DMs buried under joke emojis. Meanwhile, Evan tried to paper over the chaos with motivational emails, signing them off with hashtags like Next Gen Summit and Agile Tomorrow. Nobody replied. The countdown ticked on. Every reckless deletion, every missed disclosure, every unpaid invoice was being logged, not by Beverly's hand, but by the very system she had left humming in the background. Martin never noticed. He was too busy congratulating his son in town halls, assuring staff that disruption meant discomfort. He didn't realize discomfort was metastasizing into collapse. Each decision Evan made was not only eroding Summit Point's credibility, it was feeding the evidence packet that, when the timer reached 0, would surface at the boardroom table. They thought Beverly had walked away powerless. In reality, she had left behind a ledger of incompetence, and the ink was still drying. The boardroom smelled faintly of burnt coffee and anticipation, the kind that sat heavy in the air before a storm breaks. At 9 a.m. sharp, the audit committee assembled, leather chairs squeaking as executives shifted nervously. Martin Hale strode in first, chest out, Evan at his side carrying a sleek presentation clicker. The screen at the front glowed with a title slide, Summit Point Forward, Agile Leadership in Action. Evan whispered something about owning the stage, and Martin gave him a paternal clap on the shoulder as if the show were already won. They had no idea the curtain was about to drop on them. Patricia Gomez, the audit committee chair, entered quietly, a slim folder tucked under her arm. She didn't smile, didn't greet, just placed the folder at her seat and adjusted her glasses. The room hushed. Martin cleared his throat and launched into his opening pitch, extolling Summit Point's new lean governance model, touting efficiency gains and visionary leadership. Evan followed with slides filled with buzzwords: agility, disruption, transformation. But cracks began to show almost immediately. A finance director asked whether SEC disclosure filings had been submitted for quarter 2. Evan blinked, mumbled about restructuring reporting, and Martin jumped in with a vague assurance. Legal raised a hand. What about the missing client reconciliation protocols? Evan dismissed it as old process noise. Patricia finally opened her folder. Inside was not Martin's glossy pitch, but Beverly's auto-triggered packet. 17 pages of documentation, clauses, logs, and signatures. Patricia slid it to the center of the table. This, she said evenly, arrived in the committee inbox 48 hours ago. A disclosure package tied to a contract addendum. Martin's smile faltered. Some leftover memo from Beverly, he said, forcing a chuckle. Patricia didn't return it. Not leftover. Active. It cites Clause 14.3, transfer of fiduciary liability upon reassignment within a reporting cycle. Effective the moment you replaced her. With Evan's silence pressed into the room. Evan looked at his father, eyes wide. Martin leaned forward, voice tight. That clause can't be binding. It's buried in technical language. Patricia tapped page 6. Reviewed by legal, time-stamped, and signed. You authorized the restructuring. That makes you the initiating executive. Liability is yours. The room shifted. Finance executives sat back in their chairs, suddenly spectators at an execution. Legal opened laptops, scrolling furiously. Evan's face drained of color. He muttered, "Dad, I thought—" But Martin cut him off with a glare. Patricia didn't pause. She flipped to the attachments. Audit logs showing deleted disclosures, HR records of ignored complaints, contractor exit memos citing malpractice. Every detail cross-referenced, time-stamped, undeniable. The evidence read less like a report and more like a verdict. Martin tried again, his voice cracking at the edges. This is a misunderstanding. Beverly was vindictive. Patricia raised her hand. No. Beverly was precise. The system recorded what it recorded. You ignored governance. She enforced it. Then she leaned back, letting the weight of the words sink in. Evan fumbled with the clicker, pressing buttons that flipped the projector between empty slides and error screens. The spectacle only deepened the humiliation. An engineer at the far end finally spoke, voice low. Without the disclosures, we're exposed. The SEC will find everything. Patricia closed the folder. Then you'll explain to regulators why you buried oversight and replaced a compliance manager with your son. Martin's bravado collapsed. He sagged into his chair, hands flat on the table, sweat bleeding through his collar. Evan looked down, lips moving as if silently rehearsing excuses no one wanted to hear. Patricia's verdict was simple. Effective immediately, Martin Hale is suspended pending investigation. Evan Hale is relieved of duties. External auditors have been notified. The words landed like a gavel. No shouting followed, no debate. Just silence so thick it hummed. In that silence, Beverly's absence spoke louder than any speech. She hadn't needed to be in the room to dismantle them. The binder mocked, the demotion, the dismissal. Each had been logged, converted into proof, and delivered at the precise moment the system demanded accountability. Martin thought leadership meant control. But in the end, control belonged to the record, and the record bore Beverly's name. The board's decision landed like a closing door. Martin Hale was suspended, Evan stripped of his shiny title, and Summit Point's leadership portal refreshed without their names. Employees who had endured weeks of chaos now moved through the halls with cautious relief, whispering that maybe order would return. Patricia Gomez ordered Beverly's governance framework restored, and within hours the dashboard stabilized, audit trails came back online, and compliance checkpoints pulsed green again. Beverly's name appeared in the metadata, not as an employee but as the architect whose foresight had survived their sabotage. She wasn't there to see it. At that moment, she sat at a rival firm's office, signing an advisory contract she had secured quietly before her dismissal. The phone on her desk buzzed with Summit Point's number, but she let it ring. Revenge hadn't been about destruction, it had been about proof, about showing that arrogance collapses when tested by the record. Martin's career was over, Evan's credibility burned, and Summit Point owed its survival to the same binders they once mocked. Beverly closed her folder, breathed steadily, and walked out into the afternoon light, clear on one truth. She had been the audit trail, and the audit had spoken. I learned something during my time at Summit Point that I never expected. Arrogance is not just a character flaw, it is a systemic flaw. When Martin Hale mocked my binders, when Evan bragged about agile disruption, they weren't only belittling me, they were belittling the very systems designed to keep the company alive. They thought compliance was an obstacle, paperwork was noise, and process was irrelevant. But what they dismissed as clutter was the fragile net holding everything together. Once they cut through it, the collapse wasn't dramatic at first. It was quiet. Missed filings, ignored certifications, skipped audits. Each mistake felt small until they stacked up, and then the weight crushed them in the boardroom. The lesson I carry is that systemic collapse doesn't come from one bad decision. It comes from leaders who think they're too powerful to respect the details. Revenge, for me, wasn't a single blow. It was the moment when the system itself demanded answers, and the record I kept exposed how fragile they truly were. Martin lost his career not because I shouted louder, but because the rules he ignored caught up with him. Evan lost his title not because I fought him, but because arrogance left him defenseless. How to get started today. 1. Document everything. Don't rely on memory. Records outlast bravado. 2. Learn the systems that others overlook. Fragility hides in the fine print. 3. Never confuse silence with weakness. Patience is a stronger weapon than noise. 4. When ignored, let the system speak for you. Compliance has no bias, only truth. If you've ever seen arrogance crack a system from the inside, share your story below. Comment where you're watching from, hit like if you've felt overlooked, and subscribe so you don't miss the next collapse.